Welcome to Whisky Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 998 for April 2nd, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
We siphoned the first lot out, and then we all tried it, just to make sure that it was all right. And everyone said they thought it was okay whiskey. So then we had another drop just to make sure.
That night at Pip Hill's home in Edinburgh was the beginning of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. 40 years later, the society has 37,000 members around the world and has become one of the largest independent bottlers of not just Scotch whiskey, but whiskeys from Japan, Canada, the U.S., and other countries. Pip Hills joins us on this week's Whisky Cast in depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's Whisky Cast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
The average college basketball power forward is 6'9", which, according to my rough calculations, is 16.5 times my height. I'll stick to aimlessly pottering around in back gardens.
Proud sponsor of Whisky Cast, Redbreast. Pass it on.
Hey friends, Gabriel Cardarella here again with Dewar's Scotch Whiskey, and I have to say, Dewar's French Cask Smooth is a double-aged masterpiece, finished in apple brandy cask from Normandy to be unlike anything you've tried before. More in a bit.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. We'll start in the boardroom, where Diageo CEO Ivan Menezes announced his retirement this week after 10 years on the job. He'll be succeeded by Deborah Crew, who's currently the company's chief operating officer. The changes take effect at the end of June and bring an end to a 26-year-long career for Menezes at Diageo. He was part of the merger of Guinness plc and Grand Metropolitan back in 1997 that led to the creation of Diageo, and held a number of executive roles throughout his tenure. Menezes was knighted by King Charles in the recent New Year's Honors List for his services to business and equality. Crew was named Chief Operating Officer last October after serving as president of Diageo North America. She's the former president and CEO of Reynolds American and held executive positions with PepsiCo, Kraft Foods, Nestle, and Mars. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear has signed the barrel tax phase-out bill into law. State senators passed the bill on a final vote shortly before adjourning Thursday night. The final version of the new law stretches out the phase-out of the barrel tax to 2043. That may seem like a long time, but Kentucky Distillers Association President Eric Gregory notes that his group has been fighting the barrel tax for 75 years.
Kentucky is the only place in the world that taxes aging barrels of spirits, and it's put us in a position from a competitive disadvantage to a position where even distillers are not coming to Kentucky because of this tax that punishes growth and success. So, number one, hopefully we'll be able to attract more distillers to the state and continue building that next generation of craftsmen here in Kentucky, but also be able to keep the ones we got. And, some legislators kind of accuse us of bluffing and saying that barrels are going to leave the state. But I can tell you 100% there are conversations, there were conversations going on behind the scenes with some companies, including one company that's already bought 1,400 acres in southern Indiana, about having to move barrels out of the state because the tax is going to skyrocket so much in the next few years.
Barrel tax revenue currently goes to local governments to fund public schools, fire, ambulance, and other public services, and local leaders had railed against the phase-out because of the fear of losing that tax revenue. The final version of the bill includes safeguards to make sure that does not happen.
The way that works is if there's any decrease in school funding because of the barrel tax over the years, the state's SEEK formula, which is their education funding formula, will backfill some of that. But then distillers have agreed to pay for any remainder of that reduction. And that was a key piece because the original version of House Bill 5 that passed the House had the state on the hook for making up that shortfall. This version has distillers paying for that. And then secondly, keeping fire and medical emergency services fully funded. And that's especially important to our distillers, and we all rely on, the brave men and women who, work as firefighters, who work as EMTs and ambulances. So the way that works is if there's any reduction in their barrel tax revenue based on a benchmark or a baseline of 2025 rates, then the state can charge distillers in that county what they call a replacement fee to make up any difference.
The phase-out will begin in 2026. In other news, Canadian distillers and consumers dodged a bullet this week. Government officials announced they would cut a planned 6.3% increase in excise duty on distilled spirits and other alcoholic beverages to just 2% effective this weekend. Since 2017, excise tax rates have been linked to inflation, but with inflation causing all kinds of headaches for economists now, the decision was made to cap the excise tax escalator for the new fiscal year. Jan Westcott of Spirits Canada had been hoping for a 2-year cap, but praised the 1-year cap as a win for consumers.
Excise is the first tax that goes on. The second tax that goes on is applied by the liquor boards, their markups. And, the best markup rate in Canada is in Ontario, and it's 139.7%. And then that is all totaled up, and then that's subject to a further, in Ontario, harmonized sales tax of 13%. So it's tax on tax on tax. By the time it gets to the consumer, it's quite a bit of money.
Even with the cap for the coming year, Westcott says Canadians will still pay some of the highest alcohol taxes in the world. Another new distillery is on tap for Scotland, with some familiar faces behind the project. Angus MacRailed, also known as the Whisky Sponge, together with Johnny McMillan of Berry Brothers and Rudd and Hong Kong whiskey collector Aaron Chan, have brought together a group of investors to back Kythe Distillery. It'll be located on a farm in Perthshire and will have the goal of producing old-style Scotch whiskey. No word on when construction will begin. Knob Creek is adding an age statement to its rye whiskey. Starting now, it'll be a 7-year-old rye. The original rye was released without an age statement in 2012, but Knob Creek has been adding age statements to many of its new releases in the last couple of years, including the 12- and 18-year-old Knob Creek bourbons. The 7-year-old rye will carry a recommended retail price in the U.S. of $36.99 a bottle. Whisky Magazine handed out its World Whiskies Awards Thursday night in London, and the winner for World's Best Single Malt might surprise you. M&H Elements Sherry Cask from Israel's Milk and Honey Distillery won the top honor out of a field of 30 different regional winners. We have a link to the complete list of winners in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. The magazine also inducted 3 new members into its Hall of Fame: Bernard Walsh of Ireland's Walsh Whisky, Sukhinder Singh of the Whisky Exchange and Elixir Distillers, and whiskey author Hans Offringa. And they also announced the Icons of Whisky global winners. Heaven Hill won Distiller of the Year honors, while Greg Glass of White and Mackay was named Master Distiller of the Year, and the new Johnny Walker Prince's Street was named Visitor Attraction of the Year. Once again, we have a link to the complete list of winners in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. Finally, a sad note to report this week. Longtime Tennessee master distiller John Lunn passed away Thursday. He had been master distiller at George Dickel for years and left to join what became Sazerac's J&A Bond Distillery, working alongside his successor at Dickel, Alyssa Henley. John was just 53 years old. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long in the news section at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
I hope you'll take a minute this week to download the WhiskyCast community app and join our growing community of whiskey lovers around the world. It's social media focused on whiskey for those who love whiskey, without all of the other stuff that social media brings with it. The app is free to download from the Apple and Google app stores. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Austin Whiskey Riot is coming up this Saturday in Austin, Texas, followed by the Houston Whiskey Riot a week later. The Gothenburg Beer and Whiskey Festival is April 14th and 15th in Gothenburg, Sweden. The following weekend brings the Nth Universal Whiskey Experience in Las Vegas, the Limburg Whiskey Fair in Limburg, Germany, the Hong Kong Whiskey Festival, and the Bristol Whiskey Festival in England. The Spirit of Speyside Festival gets underway on April 26th and runs through May 1st. Whiskey and Barrel Night is April 27th in Washington, D.C. And finally, Whiskey Live Melbourne is April 28th and 29th in Melbourne, Australia. If you're organizing a whiskey event, please let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Gabriel here again. Dewar's Master Blender Stephanie McLeod has been doing some amazing things with cask finishing lately, and Dewar's French Cask Smooth is no exception. It's the 5th edition to the Dewar's Cask Finishing Series. This 8-year whiskey is double-aged, then finished in Calvados casks to blend together the best of Scottish distilling and aging with the finest in French brandy maturation. The nose is sweet honey and citrus in perfect balance. Taste it, and you'll get this unmistakable note of baked apple, citrus, and a hint of cinnamon spice. Now, I recommend it this time of year as an apple cinnamon highball, using lemon juice, simple syrup, unfiltered apple juice, and club soda, or simply enjoy it on its own. Either way, it's a specially crafted reward for your curiosity.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. We've mentioned 1983 a lot the last couple of weeks, and while that year was a troubled one for many parts of the Scotch whiskey industry, there was one highlight that year. A small group led by Pip Hills formed the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in Edinburgh. Over the years, the society has grown to around 30 chapters worldwide with 37,000 members. And it all started with a group of friends who put their cash together to buy a single cask of whiskey. I spent some time on a Zoom call with the 82-year-old Pip Hills this week. Let's go back to 1983. What were you doing in 1983 when you came upon the idea to start the Scotch Malt Whisky Society?
I had a business which was turning out to be very profitable. I had done, more or less by accident, got a job about more than 10 years before as an inspector of taxes. And this was not entirely accidental, but it certainly hadn't been a career move on my part. But I spent 4.5 years wearing a suit as an inspector of taxes and being terribly respectable, and got a bit fed up with it and decided to stop doing it. And I resigned, greatly to the surprise of the Inland Revenue, and they even flew me down to Somerset House to ask why I was resigning. And I said, well, basically, I'm bored. And I figure that whatever I'm going to do with my life, it's not this. And I had no prospect of an income, despite having resigned quite a lucrative job. But I found myself in demand because by that time I knew quite a lot about the United Kingdom's taxation system. And I found myself with an extensive, by 1983, I had an office and several hundred clients, mostly clients in the arts, theatre, etc., in universities, and a very widespread of clients. And I was acting as a gamekeeper turned poacher in the Inland Revenue. So I had a little office in the middle of Edinburgh, and I had a few ladies working for me, and this gave me quite a lot of free time. And I guess I was free to pursue other things. Now, I have a certain track record of devising schemes, just doing things that I found fun and other people found fun as well. A few years before that, I had mounted a bid to take over our local television station, despite the fact that I had not the slightest interest in television, but it seemed like a good idea, and raised enough money to buy it. Didn't, as it turned out, get it, but that was neither here nor there. It was fun doing it. I had a certain track record, I suppose. And I had been in the habit of going up to visit my friends in Aberdeenshire, and they had introduced me to their next door neighbour who bought his whisky in cask. And I guess you've heard that story. I thought the whisky was just wonderful, and I got together a small syndicate of my friends, and we asked the distiller, which was Glenfarclas, if we could buy one of their casks. And at the time, it was almost unknown for anyone outside the industry to buy a cask of whisky. And but they said, since I was a friend of Stan Barnett's, that's to say, I was a friend of a friend who was already a customer, that yes, they would send me a cask. So I got my syndicate together and we all put up cash. I think it worked out at nearly £100 a piece, for which we got a gallon of 60% alcohol whisky. And I went up to Glenfarclas, which is up in the mountains, in my old Lagonda, and brought a cask of whisky back. I wrote about this in a book called The Founder's Tale, which you've probably seen. It was a great success, and everybody loved it, and they all gave drams to their friends. And the friends all said, "This is wonderful whisky. Where can we get some?" And the friends all said, "Oh, phone Pip," and gave people my phone number. So perfect strangers would ring me up and say, "You don't know me, but I'm a friend of so-and-so who's a member of your whisky syndicate, and this wonderful whisky, where can I get some? Can you include me on your syndicate?" So there eventually came a time when I called a meeting of the syndicate and said, "Look, guys, all your friends want to join." And the syndicate all said, "That's fine. Let's double the size." So we doubled the size. And I phoned up Glenfarclas and said, "Can we have another 2 casks, please?" I mean, these were not full-size casks. They were sherry quarters. That's to say, they contained about 11 gallons each. Being small casks, they were very mature at 9 or 10 years old, because the amount of wood presented to the whisky is greater proportionately than the smaller the cask size. And anyway, I phoned Glenfarclas and they said, "Well, you can have another 2, but that's a lot." And so I got a trailer from my old motor car and went up and collected 2 casks. And the same thing happened again. And eventually a time came when I called a member of a meeting of the syndicate and said, "Look, guys, there has got to be a market for whisky this good. And why don't we set up a company and see if we'll supply it?" And we did. I applied to the Registrar of Companies for a company called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And after a bit of difficulty, the registrar said, "Yes, okay, we'll let you have that name." And so we bought 4 casks of whisky and we set up in business. We had decided early on that we wouldn't advertise, that if the stuff was as good as we thought it was, then people would come to us. And it proved to be very successful.
What was the registrar's problem with the name?
They had a policy that you couldn't just call a company any name you liked. They were especially sensitive about names which implied some kind of national significance. But that's to say, you couldn't give a company a really grand name unless there was some good reason for it. And they said, why should we let you have such a rather grandly named company? And I said, well, it's pretty simple. We are a Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and as far as I know, there isn't any other Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And the registrar thought about it for a little bit and eventually said, yes, okay, and gave us the name.
What was it like hauling that first cask of Glenfarclas back in the Lagonda?
It was rather uncomfortable because it was winter, and the Lagonda, being at that time, about 40 years old, its heater wasn't much good, and its windscreen tended to mist up and freeze in the mountains. And so it was fairly uncomfortable, but it wasn't. I was used to that kind of thing. And it was all pretty straightforward, really. And I brought it home and parked it in my garage, and I lived in the centre of Edinburgh, and the next day I called up my syndicate, and they all came round and met in the lobby of our house, and we hauled the cask. It took 2 or 3 of us to lift it, and we put it on a sort of pedestal thing, and I had bought everyone. I had bought a whole lot of gallon glass jars. At the time, there was a fashion for making your beer at home, so you could buy such things easily. It was early in the real ale move, and I got some plastic pipe, and we just sucked the whiskey out and siphoned it out into the bottles. And before we siphoned the first lot out, and then we all tried it just to make sure that it was all right. And everyone said they thought it was okay whiskey. So then we had another drop just to make sure. And then I siphoned out all the whiskey, and there was a small amount left in the cask. So we siphoned that out and we drank it. And by this time, it was quite late in the evening, and the members of the syndicate all went tottering out into the night, each of them clutching a glass jar. I had figured that one out because it was dangerous. Somebody who has drunk a good many whiskies at cask strength is not the best person to carry a glass jar. So I had made an arrangement with a local taxi firm, and they sent taxis, and everyone went off in a taxi. And it was a complete success.
A good example of responsible drinking.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Sure.
So what was the second distillery? If Glenfarclas had said, okay, you can have those 2 casks and no more.
The second run we did was also made to Glenfarclas, the second meeting of the syndicate. And that was Glenfarclas. And Glenfarclas said, we can let you have another 10-year-old and a 9-year-old. But beyond that, we think it's too young and you can't have any more. So I said, okay, 10-year-old and 9-year-old will do fine. When we started the company, we bought 4 casks for our first bottling. We bought a cask of Glenfarclas, 1 of Glenlivet, 1 of Bowmore, and 1 of Highland Park. And simply put them all in bottles. And of course, we couldn't use a distiller's name on the bottle, or they would have taken a legal action against us. And so we just gave each distillery a number. So ever after in the society, distillery number 1 was Glenfarclas, number 2 Glenlivet, and so on.
That's what I was about to go to, how you came up with the numbering system. How
Yes.
did you come up with the tasting panel idea?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we had to explain to people what the whiskey was like. And since most of the people hadn't tasted any of the whiskies that we had bottled, we had to describe them. And we had to do it remotely. So we hit on the idea of why don't we use a terminology similar to that of wine tasters and just simply describe the flavor of the whiskey. So I thought about this for a bit and decided that we had to be careful about who we asked to describe the whiskey. Now, the people involved had to be reasonably literate because we needed words. And they also had to be people who knew a bit about whiskey. Now, fortunately, in Edinburgh at the time, it wasn't difficult to find folk who met both criteria. And I asked a number of my friends. We were fortunate at that time in that one of our original members was a chap called Russell Sharp, who was a technical expert on whiskey. He was a friend from my previous days as a mountaineer, and Russell kept us right and helped us with the tasting. But apart from Russell, the rest were all people who. There were two poets. One was Willie Phillips, who was a friend of mine. Willie was a professor of Celtic at Edinburgh University, and Willie was a very funny guy, and he was something of a poet. And so Willie seemed like a good idea. And being professor of Celtic was also a good idea because a lot of the distillery names are Gaelic and the ancient Celtic language of Scotland. And so Willie could be helpful there. Another was an extraordinary character called Hamish Henderson. Hamish was quite an old man by that time and had led an extraordinary life. He was a scholar and a linguist, and he was also a folklorist. He was well known. At the time, there was a kind of folk song revival underway in Scotland, which had an American connection. When the Library of Congress, sometime in the early 1940s, decided to make collections of folklore and folk song for the library using primitive tape recorders, they sent a man called Alan Lomax to Scotland in, I think, the late 40s. And Hamish showed him round and provided him with lots of examples of native Scots folk singers. Hamish was, an extraordinary history. From being an academic, he had become a soldier in 1939. He was a friend of Antonio Gramsci and some of the Italian Communist Party. He fought in the Western Desert in the North African campaign in 1941 and 42, was in the landings in Italy, became a leader of the partisans in Italy. I have got photographs of Hamish in a jeep in an alley beside the Uffizi in Florence. He and his partisan friends. They used stolen American Army jeeps for their transport. And when one of them broke down, they just stole another one from the American Army. And he became legendary in parts of northern Italy. And the American government became worried about Hamish because he was friendly with the communists, though anything less like a communist than Hamish, it was very hard to imagine. So Hamish was one of us. There were several folk like that. And there was my friend Ian Duffield, who was a historian and who was an expert on African history, curiously. So, I mean, they were all people of of some ability. They were all people who were good with words and who knew about whisky, which most people at that time didn't. Most people, even in Scotland, knew practically nothing about whisky.
This was at a time when whiskey was really losing its popularity. We had the whiskey lock and distilleries closing.
They were using concepts and images to sell their product, which were taken from the British Empire 100 years before in many cases. And most of the images were not in the least complimentary to Scotland and not in the least complimentary to the whisky. And the one thing that was rarely mentioned in any of the advertising or imagery was the fact that the stuff tasted wonderful. They had lost sight of that completely, partly because most of the whisky sold then as now was blended whisky, which was a mixture of malt whisky with grain spirit. And a lot of that blended whisky by the 80s was of poor quality. So naturally, people who wanted high-class liquor turned to other things. There were some people by that time who knew about malt whisky, and there were distilleries who were selling it, like Glenfarclas, Macallan, Glenmorangie. They realized the advantage of single malt. And they also realized, although they did not overtly to mention the importance of the cask and maturation.
Tell me how Charlie McLean came to be involved with the tasting panel.
Charlie came on the scene rather later. I would guess it was the 1990s before Charlie became involved. And by the early 1990s, I was very much engaged in several other schemes and was tending to leave the tasting committee to other folk. I think it did very well under Charlie, because Charlie was and is really good. A man for whom I have the highest regard and wrote some very good books about whisky.
How did it go from essentially a syndicate of friends to a full-fledged business?
Gradually and with difficulty. The market kept expanding for two reasons. One was that people realized just how good this whiskey was. That wasn't the problem. We were leading the market. We were getting, and remember, because the whiskey industry had been in the doldrums through the 80s, there was lots and lots of mature whiskey lying about, which we could snap up. All we paid, you never paid for the excellence of the cask. We only paid for the alcohol. You paid so much per litre of pure alcohol per year of maturation, irrespective of the nature of the cask. So we were able to get some really great whiskey. The other thing was that we got some amazing press. And we had a good story to tell and a great product. And we weren't a big company. And the press always liked that. And so we got some fabulous press coverage. And none of it cost us anything. We got a full page in the Wall Street Journal, which Paul Levy wrote. Forbes magazine sent a team which I took round Isla, and they produced a 4 or 5 page supplement for their lifestyle magazine. David Mamet wrote a piece for Playboy about us. I mean, you cannot buy that kind of press. And that's what, that to a large extent is what propelled the thing.
The Society is credited with helping to drive the resurgence of Scotch whiskey in the 90s into the 2000s. Tell me about the international growth.
Well, it was no problem growing it in England because people in England were ready for it. We decided that by the early 90s that we would expand it to America, to the United States, to France, and to Japan. America was very successful because we found a wonderful guy called Alan Shane, who was already in the business of importing liquor. And Alan undertook to run the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in America, and he was a big success. My only proviso about Alan was that he tended to associate malt whisky with smoking cigars, and that was always a difficult combination. Cigar smokers loved it, no question about that, but I always had reservations about it. It would be like trying to. I generally reckon that appreciating top quality liquor while smoking a cigar is like trying to drink fine wine while downwind of a tar barrel. And I believe that the society in America now has pretty well reverted to our practices in the rest of the world. Anyway, the American venture was a big success, and I had a great time going to America and visiting some great people and places and meeting some great people. And the French and the Japanese didn't do so well. By that time, Japan was the boom years in Japan had come to an end, and the Japanese economy was taking a nosedive. So we spent an awful lot of money on that. And the French, curiously, proved terribly resistant. And I think this is probably more due to French nationalism, French national pride, and possibly to a certain extent, as annoyance that we were taking the market, which they felt ought to belong to cognac and Armagnac. And the cognac market was doing poorly at the same time. And you can draw a lot of conclusions from that. But I think part of their trouble was that we had a great idea going for us, and they didn't. I think it's probably still the case, but that's another question. Anyway, by the early 90s, I was spending quite a lot of time away from the office and leaving other folk to run the place. And eventually, by the mid-90s, we had spent far too much money, and we had a big overdraft at the bank. And eventually there came a point when the bank decided to call in the overdraft, and it produced a lot of difficulty. And I don't know why, but I think I'm very good at making enemies. And I managed to make a great many enemies while expanding the society. There was always a segment of people in Scotland especially who saw being part of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society as the road to social status. And I never liked that point of view at all. I didn't approve of people who did. And so there was something of a divide. And when we ran into difficulties, the dull, respectable part of the company used their dissatisfaction to blame all our difficulties on me. I'm not denying that some of them were due to me, but not all of them. And eventually they decided by 1995, they did a deal with the bank where the bank salvaged the company on condition that I leave it. They offered me the job of staying on in a purely ceremonial and non-executive capacity, but I told them to get lost. I could think of better things to do. And also, it stopped being so much fun around then.
Running the business side sort of takes the fun out of it, doesn't it?
Sorry?
Running the business side of things often takes the fun out of it.
Yes, well, I tended to leave the business side of things to other people. Frankly, it wasn't the bit that interested me. It was nuts and bolts stuff, but unfortunately, it was very necessary nuts and bolts stuff. I spent most of my time on the PR function and expanding the society. But when the crunch came, I got the blame for it.
The society is now independent. It was owned by Glenmorangie Company for a number of years, but it's really regarded as the largest independent bottler of Scotch whiskies now. You've got something like 180 distilleries that have been numbered. Where do you see the growth coming for the society in the future?
Probably just going to continue doing what it does and grow organically. The difference between the society now and the society then is twofold. One is it's got first-class management, and the other is that it's got adequate capital. And the combination of the two. And the third aspect is that when about 6 or 7 years ago, the management changed significantly, and they looked at the business and realized that it had lost some of its pizzazz. They asked me if I would come back into association with it. And they did so as part of a program of making it rather more fun than it had been. Because I think under Glenmorangie, and it had, but both, it was owned, it ran independently, I think, for about 5 years until about 2005, when it was bought by Glenmorangie. And under that transition, various people said to me, it stopped being so much fun. And I don't think Glenmorangie managed to turn that round. So it was lacking something. And I think it's a lot more fun now. And I guess I'm probably part of that, but not solely responsible by a long chalk. The people who are now running things understand that. And by fun, I don't mean the sort of fun people have in Disney World. I mean grown-up fun. I mean sensible, informed people who like drinking good liquor and who enjoy good company and good fellowship while doing it. I think that's enough fun for grown-up people. And the interesting thing is that this approach seems to have a transnational appeal. It is irrespective of culture, not just of nation, but of culture. The Japanese and the Chinese respond to it just as much as the people in Milwaukee or Ohio. It's to do with humanity rather than nationality. And I see no reason at all why the society shouldn't just continue doing what it does and doing it very well, and everyone having a lot of fun, the people who are running it as well as the people who are members of it.
Are you still having fun?
Yes. I mean, it's not a bad thing to do, talking to people like yourself, people who appreciate it. I was speaking to our man in Sweden just this morning, and they're having fun. And I certainly, any time, and I've spent quite a lot of time in the United States over the years, talking to members of the society, and I have yet to find somebody who doesn't respond to it. The only people I don't have much time for are people who regard themselves as connoisseurs. Now, to my mind, being a connoisseur of fine liquor is about taking a pride in knowing things about fine liquor that other people don't know. It's a form of egotism. And that, I think, is inimical to the sort of enjoyment of good liquor in good company. You have got to want to share the stuff as well as consume it yourself. And again, I think that appeals. Sure, there are always going to be people who join the society in order to feel superior to their friends, just as there are people who buy wine in order to feel superior to their friends. But to my mind, that's a very small proportion of the human race, which leaves rather a large market for the international expansion of the size of society.
What do you want to be most remembered for?
What do I want to be most remembered for? I couldn't care less. I'm 82 years old and I'll probably be dead pretty soon. And I have a great many friends around the world, and I have a good time talking to them and drinking whiskey with them. And I couldn't care less.
Pip Hills received the Dr. Jim Swan Award for services to Scotch whisky at last year's Scottish Whisky Awards for his role in creating the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and he's planning a tour of the U.S. for the Society later this year. That's Whiskey Cast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with one of the week's new releases, the 2x Oak Innkeeper's Blend from Dixon Deadman. This one is bottled at 52% ABV, and the nose has touches of red apples, cherries, butterscotch, a hint of spice, and a touch of old leather-bound books. The taste has notes of peppercorns, caramel, vanilla, black cherries, and a hint of plum, while the finish is long and subtle with soft spices, caramel, apples, and cherries. I'm scoring the 2x Oak Innkeeper's Blend a 92. Another new release unveiled this week, Heaven Hill's second batch of Larceny Barrel Proof for 2023. Batch B523 is bottled at 62.2% ABV, and the nose has hints of buttered popcorn, honey, vanilla, and pipe tobacco. The taste is very intense with black pepper spiciness, along with notes of black cherries, honey, and vanilla. And the spiciness carries over into the long finish. I'm scoring the Larceny Barrel Proof Batch 523 a 93. Finally, I mentioned Bruichladdich Port Charlotte Islay Barley 2014 on last week's show, and I received a sample this week. It's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose is, as you might expect from a Port Charlotte, peaty and phenolic with touches of creosote, heather, honey, and a nice malty character. The taste is peppery and pungent with cinnamon, cayenne pepper, peat smoke, heather, and a touch of barley sugar. The finish is long and smoky with lingering spices. I'm scoring the Port Charlotte Islay Barley 2014 from Bruichladdich a 93. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,400 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
This week's Community segment features a discussion from the new WhiskyCast community app. Ian Bruce posted a photo of a decanter that had been gifted recently with this note. Received an award for my long service at work. Very grateful for the Islay decanter, but it's a vessel I rarely use. Instead, I'm inclined to keep my whiskey in bottle. Does anyone else prefer to use a decanter, or have any pros or cons if one is used? Just a few of the responses. Mike's Whiskey Bunker posted, yes, for the house pour, which more often than not is Powers John's Lane. Dan's Whiskey and Cameras added this: I suspect I'd feel guilty for decanting the bottle and end up finishing it off way too fast. Sorry, liver. Or get the friends round and see it gone in one evening. Steve W. chimed in with this: Congrats on your long service award. Despite the knockers, I've learned not to completely diss the decanter. We keep 2 decanter drams on the go, having neither expensive whiskey nor high ABV, but it is good education and fun to note how the spirit changes over time. And he added in a second post, here's the fun thing we do with our decanter dram. Start at the letter A, find a distillery, for example, Aberlour, Ardmore, etc., and then add perhaps an entry-level or less expensive bottling from that distillery to the decanter. Enjoy as you see fit. When it's done and emptied, move on to the next distillery beginning with B, then C, etc. A bit of fun, particularly if you have a lovely decanter to show off to your whiskey friends. Finally, Robson M96 added this: I like the feeling of using a decanter, so I put my daily drinker, Buffalo Trace Bourbon, in it. A bottle never lasts more than a month or so, and you feel like a boss using the decanter. For the record, I have several decanters that I've never used, largely because I don't find them to be good for long-term storage, but I am thinking of creating my own house blend and using one to keep that in. Now, what's your take? Share it with us in the WhiskeyCast community app or on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. The Angel's Share has plagued distillers ever since the first whiskey went into a barrel centuries ago. Of course, the Angel's Share refers to the alcohol that evaporates from a barrel over time as the whiskey inside matures. Distillers have tried all sorts of ideas for minimizing the Angel's Share, including wrapping casks in cling film to prevent evaporation altogether. However, that keeps air from getting into the barrel, which is critical to the maturation process. Now, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reports a team of Texas inventors has come up with a new idea that might be able to reduce evaporation without affecting the flavor of the whiskey. Jeremy Grunewald came up with Aegis, a silicone-based compound that he originally intended to use on building roofs. It's a clear liquid coating that can be either sprayed or brushed onto a barrel and allows air to enter the barrel without letting alcohol evaporate. The compound is being tested now on barrels at Blackland Distillery in Fort Worth, and Grunewald believes it could reduce the Angel's Share by up to 40%. He came up with the idea after touring the Jameson Bow Street Distillery in Dublin, where the tour guides note that they lose around 26,000 bottles a day to evaporation. Right now, about 75 barrels have been treated with the compound, and Grunewald and his partners have named their company Devil's Cask. We'll keep an eye on how their tests go over time. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskeyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Friends, it's me again, reminding you to try Dewar's French Cask Smooth Blended Scotch Whiskey. The best of two cultures and traditions in one beautiful bottle. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Robin Redbreast? You may have seen me around. Face label, label face. Yeah, that's the one. I'm now contractually obligated to be their spokesbird. Yeah, my agent didn't read the small print.
Proud sponsor of Whisky Cast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Whisky Cast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.